Thank you so much to everyone who's come here in person today, attended via Zoom, watching online through our live stream. Really, it's a passion and a joy for me to share this new research here at Phoenix Seminary with a research project that's entitled Great Leadership Exchange. If this research had a physical address, it would reside at the cross streets of leadership theory and the millennial generation. Now, why would I study the millennial generation? First of all, in 2015, millennials became the largest living generation in the United States. Now, I used the U.S. government census breakdown of generation age groups. And so for millennials, that means somebody that was born between the years 82 and 2000. After that is considered Generation Z. Before that is if you were born 65 to 81, you're considered Generation X. And then if you were born in 45 to 65, you are considered a boomer. And so what's interesting about this is that millennials in 2015 now represent the largest population in the United States. And then in 2018, if you look at those numbers, the last one being born in 2000, that means as of 2018, all millennials are officially adults. Now, when I say that, or when I've shared that with people, the typical response I got back was one of a little bit of being scared. Because, oh no, they're all adults, we're in trouble now. Well, here's another scary statistic, is that those in the boomer demographic are hitting the age of retirement at 10,000 a day. At the same time, you notice the dip in Generation X, and that equates to millennials being 22% more populous than Generation X. And so as boomers get ready to retire, even if Generation X tries to fill all those spaces, they won't be able to on a sheer numbers basis. And if they do, then those mid-level leadership positions now are vacated. And when you combine both, it leaves a great leadership vacuum and sets up for what I have called the Great Leadership Exchange. What is the Great Leadership Exchange? It is really going to happen over the next decade as churches will experience the largest leadership shift in church history. The question driving this research is, how are Boomer and Generation X leaders effectively attracting and training millennials for leadership positions in evangelical churches? Now, the typical conversation you hear when followed with a conversation on the topic of millennials usually comes up with some griping or pushing back, or they're entitled, or as some type of negative bent. But what I've come to believe through this research is that you can either judge millennials or you can influence them, but you cannot do both. And whether you like it or not, millennials are here to stay. And there's a lot of benefits that come with this new generation of leaders in evangelical churches. If you would, just picture a 4x4 relay team. Now, a 4x4 relay team is successful when one runner who is completing his lap is running at full speed, allows the new runner to get from a starting position to run to full speed, and then the handoff takes place when both runners are at their peak speed. Now, what I've seen in different organizations, not just in the church world, but in business world as well, is that the existing runner, the existing leader, will run until they can't run any longer, eventually drop the baton, and the replacement leader has to pick up the baton from the ground and start from a standing position. And so the heartbeat behind this research is, what will Boomer and Generation X leaders do to better prepare millennials who are drastically different, which we're going to get to in a moment, for better leadership positions? Now, before we get into the practical discussion of leadership, I do want to give a foundation that comes from Scripture. When it comes to leadership in the Bible, there is no greater leader than Jesus Christ himself. And in 1 John 2:6, we are called to follow him, or to walk as Jesus walked. Also, you find in Scripture repeated stories of successful leadership transitions from one generation to the next. For example, you see Jesus empowered and discipled and sent his disciples out to launch the movement known as the church. And we see that exemplified in the Great Commission found in Matthew 28. Another example of a leadership transition is Paul to Timothy. One of my favorite verses in all of the Bible is 2 Timothy 2:2, in which Paul is writing to Timothy, and he says, "And the things that you've heard from me, entrust to faithful men who will teach others also." So in one verse, you have 4 generations of leaders, and that is the picture of leadership transition and leadership development. And when you look into the Old Testament, you also see multiple examples of leadership succession and development. 2 examples I want to highlight for you is Moses to Joshua. And that's an important leadership transition because Moses, who was called to lead the people into the promised land, didn't actually finish the journey. And so Joshua picked up that mantle and successfully brought the people of Israel into the promised land. And so when the vision outlives the leader, that is evidence of successful leadership development. And then another picture you have of leadership transitions is Elijah to Elisha. And I point out 1 Kings 19 because Elijah was in a dark, lonely place. He was broken down. He was fearful for his life. And God called him to stand back up and to let him know that his job is not done. And what was that job? Well, that job was to anoint, to call, to train, and to send the next prophet, which was Elisha. And Elisha goes on to do roughly double the number of miracles of Elijah. And so here you have the leadership baton being passed from one prophet to the next, and then the ministry actually expands, which is another positive example of leadership development. Now, when you talk about leadership, there are lots of definitions out there and lots of leadership books. In my research, one commentator noted, you're going to find over 350 different leadership definitions out there. Trying to define leadership is a lot like holding Jell-O. You know you got something, but you can't really grab onto it fully. Or other people describe defining leadership like defining love. You know good leadership when you see it, just like you know love, but sometimes it can be hard to put into words. Well, after studying the various definitions that were out there, I combined some of the basic foundational principles and came up with this definition. Leadership is the process of influencing others to work together for a common purpose. So here, what I like about this definition is the 4 values established within leadership. First, leadership is a process because it's a journey. It's more about direction than it is a destination, that you always have some type of leadership role to do. Second, leadership is influence. As John Maxwell says, leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. I love that leadership is influence because you can lead no matter your position or your title. You can lead up, you can lead out, you can lead down, and you can even lead within. And so it's more about an attitude than it is simply an action. The next value of leadership is the fact that it involves working together because there are certain things in life that you cannot do alone. And leadership is one of those things. If no one is following you, then you're not really leading. And so the role of the leader is to get others to work together. And then the last component of that definition is for a common purpose. When you think of a business team, when you think of a church organization, when you think of a sports team, people rally around a shared vision. And that is the heartbeat or the foundation of a healthy leader. Now, I want to briefly share with you the history of leadership theory because the study of leadership is actually relatively new in the academic world. Most writings of leadership actually began within the last 75 years. And there are 6 major leadership theories that have progressed over those last 75 years. The first leadership theory was described as trait leadership, otherwise known as the great man theory. In other words, you looked for certain attributes and traits to identify who could be the leader within the group. Soon after that, it moved to what's called skills leadership. So instead of focusing on attributes, people then focused on abilities and what can you do to be a leader within the group. Now, after skills leadership, it moved to what's called style leadership. And here you start to get more well-known writers. In this particular case, you might have heard the name Peter Drucker, or the effective executive. The idea behind this was that it's not okay just to identify abilities. It's all about what you do with those abilities or behaviors. And so it identifies the actions of a leader. And then you move from that, and a guy named Ken Blanchard actually identifies that, well, depending on the situation or the circumstance, you have to act differently as a leader. And so then he described it as situational leadership, and by identifying certain situations in which leaders act in a particular way. Now, I'll give Ken Blanchard credit because actually as the leadership theories progressed, he wrote more and new books that progressed along with that style. But situational leadership is probably most known in his book that's still read today, called The 1-Minute Manager. And so then from situational leadership in 1977, Robert Greenleaf coined a term, servant leadership. The idea of a leader was to use his power to elevate the people around him. Instead of asking, what can people do for you, the role of the leader is to say, what can I do for them? And in Christian circles, the idea of servant leader really took off because it's modeled by Jesus. In Mark 10:45, Jesus says that I am here not to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And so a lot of Christians like Oswald Sanders, also Henry Blackaby, and Christian writers in the leadership world grabbed hold of that and wrote entire books on the idea of being a servant leader. Now, the last predominant theory of leadership takes place, if you can picture, situational leadership and servant leadership coming together and having a baby. Because when you combine situational leadership and servant leadership, you end up with what's called transformational leadership. James Byrne in 1978 said that there are transactional leadership actions and transformational leadership actions. Transactional is when I will give you money and you will give me hours of work, or I will give you goods and you will give me services. But Burns noted that the best leaders actually, at the end of it, make people better. And when you elevate who people are and who they become, both the follower and the leader are transformed into better people. This idea really resonated in our culture, especially in American entrepreneur capitalistic society, and writers really launched a whole new category of writings. And so in the 80s and early 90s, you get books like Jim Collins' Good to Great. You have Cozart's and Posner's The Leadership Challenge. You have Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You have the 2,000, I think, books that John Maxwell has written. I don't know. I feel like it's really one book written 2,000 times, but they all focus around this idea of transformational leadership. And to this day, transformational leadership is the predominant view, and one that I actually hold to and value, because these books that were written 20, 30 years ago were all about humility, service, and elevating one another up to a higher and a better place. And so where we land today, where the rest of this research lands, is really an application of transformational leadership. Now, because we're talking about the Great Leadership Exchange, I also did research into what's called transitional leadership, when one person in a leadership position moves on and the other one comes in. And while I read a bunch of different books on the topic, the two that really stood out, the two that are quoted the most often, that had the most sales, that were quoted in different papers and journals and success stories, were Managing the Transitions from William Bridges and Leading Change by John Cotter. And so if you're interested, if you need to make a changing movement within your team or your organization, I highly recommend you pick up those two resources, because they give you metaphors, language, and actual steps to take to lead your organization to a new place. Now, that's the leadership side of things. Now I want to move into the discussion of who, in fact, are the millennials. Now, just picture the idea of a they grew up, because every generation is shaped by the events surrounding when they were born. For example, being born 45 to 65 is a generation that was coming just on the other side of World War II. And so when they were growing up, they were in a culture that valued country and community. Think Leave It to Beaver, think Go America. It was us versus the world. We won, we were victorious. High value of community. But then you get to the Gen X generation, born in 1991, and now you see a rise of individualism. So think rock and roll, think hippie movement, Woodstock. At the same time, you had a lot of distrust happening within the country. The civil rights movement, you have Vietnam, you have the scandal of Watergate. So now there's this emphasis on adults and being an individual and being who you want to be. Even in court rulings like Roe v. Wade happened in that case, and so that population actually went down in terms of births happening in that window, and so Generation X is actually lower than both boomers and millennials. Well, then those two groupings, depending on when they decided to have kids, had kids, and you're in a culture where you're fearful for your life because we're in a Cold War, but yet we feel good, the country is growing. You see things like malls popping up and radio and television and movies exploding, and so you can do what you want. You're super hopeful, but you're really focused on your kids. And so the movement, the focus goes from country to adults to kids. Now you have more safety regulations than ever before. You have a war on drugs. You have a war on poverty. You have introductions of kid-specific programming, the Disney Channel, Nickelodeon. You see a lot of family-based TV shows. Think Family Matters, Full House. As they become older, you see teen shows, Saved by the Bell, One Tree Hill. You have Dawson's Creek. All this, it all grew up with the millennial generation. I want my kids to be successful, and so I'm going to stay around them. The term helicopter parenting became a thing. At the same time, school and sports and everything became much broader. So everyone got a participation trophy, but if you competed in club sports, it became 24/7. And schools added AP classes, and so they put pressure on, okay, you got to succeed, you got to succeed. We're going to make you safe, but you have to achieve. And so all of these things come around the millennial generation. At the same time, the family dynamics. Did you know that in 2013, now with Generation Z, so you can see the progression here, that 40% of children are born to unwed mothers. 40%. In 1960, only 5% were born to unwed mothers. Now the millennial generation growing up in these family dynamics actually are waiting to get married till they're later, waiting to move out of the house. Everything's kind of being delayed and pushed back with this pressure to succeed. And so I did some research and compiled all the research that is out there for the millennial generation and came up with one list that I would call the 10 characteristics of millennials. Now, before I share these stats, I want to note a quote from a guy named Paul Taylor from Pew that says this: "The data helps us tell the story of ourselves to ourselves. It creates a frame around the picture of a particular generation." So I admit not every millennial fits this description that I'm about to share with you. And I also admit that when you're in a stage of life, things change. But what I want to share with you today is specific data that points that the millennial generation is drastically different than Gen X or boomers. And if we can embrace those changes, then we can be better positioned to influence and impact them for the future of churches and leadership as we know it. So here are the 10 characteristics. Number one, they are diverse in population. The population of the United States has doubled in the last 50 years. We moved from 150 million to almost 330 million in the last 50 years. That's a lot more people in the same space. And out of that, 2 in 5 are non-white. That's a 15% increase from the boomer generation. Next, they're seen as disengaged with religion. 35% of millennials claim no religious affiliation when surveyed. This is commonly referred to as the rise of the nuns. No, not a convent nuns, but the rise of no religious affiliation. And the other thing that's alarming is that you take any spiritual practice or habit, and millennials lower than Gen X and boomers. So church attendance, or reading the Bible, or praying. You pick any category and millennials scored lower than previous generations. Now the next shows the opposite, that millennials are digital and lifestyle. You take any digital statistic and millennials are actually higher than previous generations. For example, 56% of millennials check their phones first thing in the morning and right before bed, compared to 40% of Gen Xers and 33% of boomers. Distinct in expression. George Barna coined a term, modularity, to describe extreme individualism. Think of it this way. Previous generations would buy the Lego set, put all the pieces together, and then they're done. Now, what happens to the Lego set after a few days of being put together? It all gets dumped into the same box. Now, you have this box with all these different sets, all these different pieces, and then the kids end up grabbing and making new stuff out of whatever pieces they want. This is the idea that millennials take with them, that they no longer have to accept or reject something in its entirety, that they can actually pick which pieces they want to believe in and form their life and their worldview around. Number 5, they are different worldview. Postmodernism is the predominant view in our world today, which basically says that truth is not up to the author, it's up to the receiver of a particular message. In other words, you get to decide what is truth. D.A. Carson noted that dictionaries have literally changed the definition of tolerance. Previously, the definition of tolerance was defined and described as the acceptance of the existence of differing viewpoints. They took out the word existence, so now the current definition of tolerance reads, the acceptance of differing viewpoints. When you take out that word existence, what you're doing is taking out the assumption that while we disagree as people, I will respect you as a person. And by defining tolerance as the acceptance of differing viewpoints, what you're saying is you have to say every viewpoint is equally true. The ultimate virtue of this generation is tolerance. And so if you are not tolerant of someone's behavior, someone's belief, what they say, what they do, then we're the one that's going to be judged. Number 6, millennials are desirous for community. Over and over and over again, in any survey you pull out, the top priority is family. In the Tom Rainer survey, when asked what's really important in life, the number one answer was family at 61%. That's more than double the second answer. And the second place answer was actually friends. And so when asked about the priority for them becoming an adult, it's relationship, relationship, relationship. Number 7, determined for achievement. When you see millennials, a lot of times they get described as entitled. When in actuality, numbers, they're actually the most achieving, highest achieving people, statistically speaking, of any generation. Here's what I mean. In 2007, more people in age bracket of 25 to 29 held college degrees than any other previous time in American history. And if you think about sports, if you have children in sports, you're not just competing in one season. You're competing all year and all weekend, and travel ball and AAU and club ball and competitive and recruiting. And so now in the age of social media, you're now competing with everybody in the world. And so there's more AP classes, there's more competition in colleges, there's more people in our country, so there's more people competing for the same spots. And so there's actually this high drive for achievement at the same time value safety, and so there's actually an embedded fear of failure. Number 8, distressed over expectations. That I was just mentioned to you is that they want to succeed, they want to be successful, but they see everybody around them. And so they feel the pressure of every social media post, every news story, everything they see on TV. In a 2007 survey, 94% of college students surveyed reported feeling being overwhelmed, 44% battled some form of depression, and even 10% considered suicide. So there's this battle, this sense of overwhelm and depression that they go through every day. Number 9, discouraged in finances. Now, this statistic shows that there really is a generational difference and not a stage of life difference. In 1983, the net wealth comparison between a 65-year-old and a 35-year-old was 8-to-1. That means that someone who was 65 on average had 8 times the wealth of someone who was 35. That same difference in 2013 is 20-to-1. That means that in today's age, the 65-year-old actually has 20 times the wealth of the average 35-year-old. And if you think back to what our country has gone through in the last 30 years, college has gone up, housing has gone up, cost of living has gone dramatically. At the same time, starting wages have stayed roughly the same. And most millennials hit the job market around the year 2008. Think what happened in 2008. That was when the market crashed. And so they are very discouraged in finances, which is why a lot of millennials are staying at home. They have this pressure to succeed. I'm waiting to get paid. Everything costs a lot more, and so I'm going to stay home. So more people are at home than ever before. But here's an interesting thing, and here's what gives me hope. When surveyed, 96% of millennials agreed with the statement, I believe I can do something great. With everything that they're going on, they are the most optimistic group out there. And they want to be together. They want to adventure together. If you look at TV cartoons, it's even changed over the years. Decades ago, it was Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. And then it moved to Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, Harry Potter, this Avengers. Millennials really long to have an adventure together. And so they're open to working with each other. They're open to working with people who maybe believe differently than them. They want to work together, they want to be mentored, and they believe that they can do something great. And so that leads me to the next thing here of what can churches do to reach millennials? Kara Powell, who wrote the book Growing, said this: millennials are searching for answers for 3 questions. Who am I? Where do I fit? And what differences do I make? In looking at the research, I looked at every resource I could find and every major resource out there that was religious in nature and compiled it in one list. And so what I want to share with you now are 7 keys based on current research to reaching millennials in an evangelical setting. Number 1, first key to reaching millennials is Christ, marked by deep biblical preaching. Fascinating is while millennials are going to church less often, what they are fascinated by is the person and the story of Jesus. And so preaching that connects to where they are as humans and the humanity and the deity and the full story of Jesus really resonate with millennials. Number 2, community. In every research study I found, community was listed as one of the top values. So much so that I almost put community first, but I felt like I couldn't put anything ahead of Jesus, so I put it as number 2. So community marked by empathy. Number 3, character. Millennials facing social media pressure, a lot of them growing up in divided homes, they want to know that you are who you say you are. They question everything. You got to think in the 90s, there's the O.J. Simpson trial, there's the Bill Clinton trial, there's everything just kind of starting to blow up. They grew up with social media. As they became adults, social media became a thing. And so now they want to know, are you who you say you are? Number 4, cause, marked by empowerment. How can we go out into the world and make a difference? Number 5, culture. Millennials are not okay with living and staying in the bubble. They want to know, can we go down the street and interact where people are and meet them now? Are you willing to engage in culture, and are you willing to help engage in culture? Number 6, clarity by vision. We are being bombarded with different messages today. And so in the midst of chaos, can you provide a clear message that really is not just more information, but ultimately leads to transformation? Number 7, creativity, marked by innovation. The millennials are the last generation that still understand and know what analog is. They started with analog, moved to digital. Generation Z is only digital at this point. And so they want to know, are you willing to move as an organization with the times and keep improving? Now for the research. I decided to do what's called a collective case study, or a qualitative research study, on the idea of millennials, because I wanted to discover the best practices of churches that were effectively attracting and training millennials. And so my collective case study was bounded by topic, time, and location. So I did not study churches' evangelism strategies, receptivity to preach, focused in on their development of younger leaders. It was bounded by time because the data was collected in 2020. Now, COVID made it a little more difficult to collect the data, but the organizations were gracious and their programs existed before, existed during, and are going to continue to exist in the future. And so I felt okay moving forward with research this past year. And then last, it was bounded by location. I studied 2 evangelical churches who are growing, who have a track record of training millennials, and then also exist in Maricopa County, Arizona. And when I contacted these churches, when I reached out, then I had 4 points of data collection. Observations, so I watched our weekend service. I watched staff meetings. I also observed residency programs and trainings that they had. I had semi-structured interviews with 2 executive leaders from each of the church's staff. And then I ran focus groups of residency program or who were on staff at the church to see how the leadership training was impacting their growth as leaders. And then lastly, I viewed their documents. And so that's anything written or shown. And so website, video, manuals, trainings, anything I could get my hands on. Then I compiled all that information together and then ended up with the research that I'm about to share in just a moment. Quick snapshot of the 2 churches studied is I studied Christ Church of the Valley. Started in 1982. Before the pandemic, was seeing 35,000 services. They had 10 campuses. Actually, since the time of my research, they've launched 2 additional campuses, but at the time, they just had 10. In 2019, they were listed as one of the fastest growing churches in the country, according to Outreach Magazine. And of their 421 staff members, 47% are millennials. In 2017, they went through a successful pastoral transition from Don Wilson to Ashley Woldritz, and they've continued to grow beyond that transition, which I think is evidence of a system and intentional decisions that are impacting their development of young leaders. And then lastly, they run a graduate level residency program that they call the Leadership Institute. The second church I studied was Rock Point Church. This started in 2002. Before the pandemic, we're seeing 3,500 people every weekend. They moved into a brand new facility in 2020. And then in 2017, they too made Outreach's magazine of fastest growing churches in all of the country. Of their 81 staff members, 49% are millennials. And then they run a similar residency program, except their residency program is for undergraduate level students. And so when I studied these churches, I really focused my attention on what is it that they're learning? What is it that these millennials are attracted to? What's keeping them there at the church? When I studied CCV, the theme that kept coming up over and over and over again was this idea of empowerment. In my executive level interviews, in my focus group, in my observations, and in the documents, all centered around the idea of empowerment. Then when I studied to the top was the idea of trust. Over and over and over again was the of trust. The leaders said it, the focus group workers said it. We'll get into specifics here in a moment, but trust was this everywhere I looked. And so I sat there after transcribing all the messages, interviews, going through everything, and I was wondering the connection between trust and empowerment. And then I had a light bulb moment that changed everything for me. And that is that trust and empowerment are 2 sides of the same coin. And that relationship, that specific relationship, to attracting and training millennial leaders. So to say that again, the key to attracting and training millennial leaders is to intentionally create and communicate a culture of trust and empowerment. You see, what I realized was that trust is a relationship, and empowerment builds responsibility, and you need both to develop leaders. And healthy organizations manage to do both. So out of this came a brand new tool that I'm publicly sharing for the first time called the Trust versus Empowerment Grid. So you can see here that you have empowerment on one side and you have trust on the other, because you need both to be a successful and a healthy and a growing organization. If you have low empowerment and low trust, you'll be what I call a micromanager. The micromanager needs to have say in everything that is done. The workers have no power and they have no relationship. And the end result is apathy. And so you have a team that's not motivated to work hard because they don't have any authority to make decisions and they don't trust the person they're working for. And so there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of mistakes, and there's a lot of issues there in apathetic workers. So to help you remember that, just think about it this way, that if you are a micromanager, if you think of a stormtrooper, okay, a stormtrooper, right, they have zero resilience. They have horrible aim. They're not skilled at what they do. They get shot and fall down immediately. Same is true for micromanaged workers. They're not skilled, there's high turnover, and there's lots of issues. And so the end result of a micromanager is one of a team of stormtroopers. Okay. Now, if you have high trust but low empowerment, you're what I call the Minion Maker. The Minion Maker, if you remember the movie Despicable Me, okay, you have Gru and all his workers are these little, fun little, lovable yellow guys called minions. Now they have great relationship. There's a lot of laughing. I mean, in the movie you have a fart gun. I mean, that's just hilarious for kids and adults, if I'm just being transparent with you. And the decision maker in that group is the leader. As long as you have a great decision maker, you can be deceptively successful. The problem is when they want to grow in their leadership, they're going to hit and they're going to get frustrated that they are not empowered to lead more, and they're going to leave your organization. Or the other problem is when that great decision maker leaves the organization, now they're left with a bunch of minions and no one at the head to make healthy choices, and now they're left stuck. Now, the other side creates an interesting problem, as I call that the silo builders. Silo builders are people who have high empowerment but low trusting relationships. And silo builders, these are organizations where individual departments or ministries or teams can be really successful, but they don't talk to each other. And so the end result here is really one of isolation. Because think about Batman for a second, okay? Batman is really good at what he does. Batman is very successful. And some of these organizations, they would love to have a Batman. The problem is nobody wants to work with Batman. Batman doesn't get along with anybody. It's not going well. They haven't really, had as much success with the league, okay, as some of the other ones. And so you don't want to work for Batman because he's going to do what he wants. He just wants to be left alone. Where the silo builders run into trouble is when you have a budget conversation, because then everybody's out for them. Looks like you're playing a game of hungry, hungry hippos. Nope, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Or the other problem is when something goes wrong, everybody plays the game because they are in these individual silos and they're not connected to an overall healthy team. So you don't want to be the micromanager. You don't want to be the minion maker. You don't want to be the silo builder. What you want to be is the hero multiplier. This is a culture that is created and values high empowerment and high trust. In other words, you want to identify and encourage and elevate the superpowers of your team members. So in this particular case, think about the Avengers and Captain. If you got Captain on your team, he was not intimidated by the other powers of other Avengers. Instead, they wanted to unite together to fight the evils of the world. And so the end result is one of collaboration. And so you want that bond to believe in you. See your strengths as the strengths of the team. To see that if you go to the next level, our organization goes to the next level. Imagine working for a boss that you know on a personal level, and they know you on a personal level, and they believe in you, and they're dependent upon your success. Wouldn't you want to work for that boss? Don't you want to be that boss? You can if you are the hero multiplier. So what does this mean? Well, how do we build that? Well, I found in the research that you can build trust in building 3 values within an organization. The first one is approachability. Approachability. Ask yourself, are you accessible? Can your people ask you anything? Do you listen? In the research, Bill Bush at Rockpoint gives his leaders a vote in decisions that connects to their ministries, and then he gives them a voice even in the bigger decisions that they don't get to decide. In other words, he invites the younger leaders into the room to help discuss the decisions that are going to be made. Also, in between services, he referred to it as leading by walking around. In other words, having regular conversations with his staff members and just being known, not as the lead pastor, just simply as Bill. At CCV, it's a much larger organization. So you might think it's hard to be relational with 421 employees. Well, once a month they do staff meetings, leadership trainings to gather them together, and then they host Ask Anything lunches, where smaller groups of people get to sit down with the executive team and ask anything they want to know on a personal basis. Also, the residents, when they come into CCV, are immediately placed their desk next to the supervisor. They have direct connection and relationship with the people that they are working with. Once you're approachable, the next thing is to be authentic. How well do your people know you? How well do you know your people? And then do you show them how the bread is made? What I mean by that is picture a bakery and the front display case. Instead of just showing them the finished bread cakes, take them and actually share the secret recipe. Actually show them how to make the bread and then allow them to knead the dough and to be a part of the baking process. Yes, they're going to get a little messy. Yes, they might not make a bread for the display case at first. Include them in the process. One of the residents at CCV said that authentic or being real is really the currency of the residency program. Is that it's the currency of his generation. And then at Rockpoint, the executive leaders talked about how it's important for them to connect before they correct. And so this idea of valuing people. Do they know you? Do you know them? Are you real? The third way to build a culture of trust is really centered around the idea of accountability. Do you follow through? Do you offer feedback? And do you regularly raise the bar? At Rockpoint, in the focus group, all the millennial leaders said, yes, they give us freedom, but then they expect results. And they have evaluations immediately after the services and immediately after the events. There's a great story at CCV where one of the leaders was training one of the residents and said to him, hey, I'm going to baptize this person. It was at the first service. He said, I want you to watch closely because you're baptizing second service. And so freaked out. He was only on the job for a couple weeks, and now he's baptizing someone for the first time. Second service, he baptized them, and then after the second service, he immediately sat down with the leader, and they talked about how it went. One of the ways they do that there for accountability, Reggie Rice, the director of the Leadership Institute and the adult ministries there at CCB, says that they use an approach where it's I do, we do, you do. And so this idea of holding people accountable, walking them through, giving them the chance to succeed, but then coaching them afterwards. And then Jeff Larson, who is the Next Generation Director, as well as the Director of the Residency Program at Rockpoint, he put it this way: how can I hold someone accountable for my idea? And so they give the freedom to make decisions, but then they hold them accountable for whether or not that event, that decision worked or failed. So approachability, do they have access to you? Know you. And then accountability, do you do what you say you're going to do? Another value of CCV is what they call zero gaps. They strive to have zero gaps between what someone says and then what's done. And so do you have zero gaps in your leadership? Because when you follow through, you're accountable. When you are authentic and real in who you are, and then you're approachable and they can have conversations with you, you're going to build trust with your team members. How do you build a culture of empowerment? 3 things. Number 1, regularly repeat vision, mission, and values. Now, this one is often talked in leadership books, but I want to point out that it is executed very well at both churches. That everyone from executive staff to residents were able to recite the vision, mission, and values of a particular organization. Along with that at CCV, they have the values printed in their offices and in their residency training program rooms. And then at Rock Point, while their values aren't as printed, so at CCV, the values actually spell the word Christ, and they practice and discuss this each and every week. At Rock Point, each ministry actually comes up with their own set of values, but they're connected to the vision. All the values are together in one book, and so that every ministry knows what another ministry values. And so they had very clear expectations on where they're going to go. Now, that's the next thing, is that clarifying expectations. They didn't just have clear vision, mission, values. They clearly expected them. When you can clearly articulate the expectation, that allows you to have the proper accountability. Sometimes leaders get in trouble when they have a very vague description. And so someone thinks that they're successful when in reality the leader was something completely different. And then the last thing here is, do you communicate categorical decisions? At CCV, they have so many employees, so many campuses. What they offer is what the military refers to as commander's intent. In other words, they say, go take that hill. Now, they have strategies to go take that hill, but what happens when you get on the battlefield? Things change. And if you know the commander's intent, if you know that's the hill we're going to take, then the team members, the lower level leaders, can make adjustments on their own, knowing that they're going to achieve the objective of the overall team. In other words, ministry teams and successful leaders who are training and attracting millennial leaders give clear objectives. We're going to go take this hill. Now you go do it. And so they give clarity behind it. Because then after they have clarity, they offer consent. This is the permission to play. One of the residents at CCV actually said, it was backed up by the literature review, was that her generation, a lot of her workers have a fear of failure. Another resident said that he felt stuck in a needs gap, that waiting from college, he wanted experience. But the churches he applied to wouldn't take anyone unless he already had experience. And so the creation of the residency program was to give people hands-on experience and to learn on the job. An example of this was that they, one person came in and they have a multi-million-dollar sports facility. It was the second week on the job. And he said, hey, I want you to look and observe how I'm running this program. And so he observes the program, and then he get done with the night and say, okay, hey, next week you're running it. And sure enough, he showed up to the facility week 2 on the job, and he was the only staff member there. And so he said he felt really stressed out, but then he also felt empowered because he had the ability to go, and they trusted him to actually lead and to have responsibility. It's not just delegating tasks, but responsibility. A major example at Rock Point that was stated by everybody interviewed was their young millennial middle school director came to the leadership team and said, right now we're running programs on the weekend and midweek. I really think that we could grow if we stop the weekends and we focus all of our attention on the midweek, so we can do worship, leadership, everything on that one night of the week. And so they talked through it, they processed through it, and they said, do you really believe it? They said, yes. Of 3,500 people, they let the middle school director change the day of the week of the program. and they supported it. And so the executive team got emails, they got questioned, and they supported the staff member 100%. And he said, now we're going to hold you accountable to this, but we're going to give you permission to try it. And so he tried it, and lo and behold, the ministry actually grew. And so they gave them permission to play, but then they saw the fruit from it. Now, another example was they had another young worker who wanted to try this particular outreach event called Skit Night. Jeff Larson, the Next Generation's director, didn't think it would go well. I don't think this is going to go well, but you know what? I'm going to let you do it. And so the night before the event, the young leaders came back to him and said, I don't think this is going to go well. We need to stop it. And he said, nope, it was your idea. You need to execute. And they tried and used it as a learning experience, and now that particular staff member has been on staff for multiple years since that time. So they use failure as learning opportunities, and they move forward because they follow it up with this thing, which is coaching. Do you share immediate evaluations? Are you a barrier or a bulldozer? Bill Bush at Rock Point loves that phrase. Are you a barrier or a bulldozer? Meaning, I don't want to be the barrier that keeps you from becoming the leader that God has called you to be. Instead, I want to be the bulldozer that removes barriers that's holding you back. And so their executive team goes in and says, what can we do to make our younger leaders more successful? And at CCV, the leaders that actually have volunteers underneath them are actually called coaches. So it's a high value. And so if you want to build a culture of empowerment, consider clarity, consent, and coaching. Now, what about small churches? Because Rock Point and CCV are considered mega churches. Well, to quote Dr. Strack, who's president of Student Leadership University, and I had a conversation with him years ago, and he said this, hey, if you're trying to learn something new, simply start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And that's the advice that I would share to anyone who's leading a small church right now. Consider the principles from this research and begin having conversations with your team. Start where you are. You might not have a residency program, but you probably have young leaders that you can empower. You might not know everybody in your church, but do some people know you well? Build relationships, start having those conversations, start holding someone accountable. And so just take practical things one step at a time. You might not be able to apply all 6 best practices this week, but I bet you can have one conversation about one of those principles and improve your leadership right now. Recommended research for the future. All of this came from a collective case study of 2 growing evangelical in Maricopa County. And then it matched what was found in the literature review. And so combining the literature review, seeing that CCV was 10 times the size of Rock Point, but yet I found all 6 practices and both trust and empowerment in both organizations, I truly believe that they will be applied to future situations and circumstances. But that would be up for someone else or maybe myself for a future research project. Another recommended research for the future would be the idea that could this construct work outside of a church setting? I believe so, because a lot of religious writings like John Maxwell and others have actually done better in the business world than even the church world. And I think the trust and empowerment grid would work in settings outside of a church setting. Lastly, I just want to acknowledge that the craziness that was COVID-19. Curious to find out how will leadership change as a result of churches coming on the other side of the pandemic. Maybe a year, 5 years, 10 years down the road, see if this trust and empowerment grid will hold up as a result. Final thoughts and conclusions. I really enjoyed the process of learning. I'm not necessarily an academic myself, but I love learning. And so when I had that light bulb moment of trust and empowerment, how it's not about being the flashiest organization. It's not about having all the newest stuff. It's about knowing your people, building trusting relationships, and then building empowering responsibility. That into the future, I got really excited. So I am a church planter. I am finishing at school. And actually, at the end of this research, I am more excited than ever for millennial leaders to move to large leadership church positions. But who knows? Maybe I'm just hopeful because I am a millennial. So thanks, guys.